I've got some questions here for Howard, but I guess other people may have thoughts if they want to chip in as we go along. I think we're open to a little bit of audience participation in that sense. Howard, just to start with, for the benefit of people who may not be so familiar, what actually is Crossrail? Is it a metro? Is it a suburban railway? Is it a bit of both?
It's a bit of both. For those not familiar with London, effectively Crossrail is a tunnel that will connect the existing suburban railways that come into the east, Liverpool Street, and in the west into Paddington. So Crossrail itself as a project is about 21 kilometres of double-track tunnel through the middle of London, 9 new stations, but actually running out, it's about 120 kilometres in total, so running out quite a long way into the suburban area. And what it does, apart from adding 10% to London's rail capacity at a stroke, is connect the suburbs to the multiple business hubs of London these days, i.e. Canary Wharf, the City, the West End, and then running through to Heathrow Airport. So it links everything up. That's what Crossrail's there for. By definition, therefore, it has to be both a fairly intensive suburban railway, but also in the core a 24 trains per hour, ultimately 30 trains per hour metro service.
You say you're going to add 10% to capacity, but the vast majority of the network's running on existing lines. So is that really all about sort of central? The central section?
Yes, there's the new section through the centre. So if you add, as I say, 24 or more 10-car long, 200-metre long trains through the centre of London, that's quite a capacity boost in itself. You're then running both longer and more frequent trains into the suburban areas. So that's where the capacity increase comes from. And Crossrail's a very, very expensive scheme. It costs around £15 billion sterling, but the benefits, the direct economic benefits, are judged to be around £30 billion, and they come from a mixture of crowding relief on a very busy existing network, speeding people's journeys through greater frequency, through greater connectivity. The other one that sits outside that, but's very important and interesting us a lot in London these days, is the idea of agglomeration benefits. And it's quite a simple idea, although it sounds complicated. Essentially, it's the story of urbanisation. It's saying that if you can assemble a big population and move people and allow people to travel and work absolutely optimally with each other by meeting face to face, optimally by finding themselves that job that they're that little bit more suited for or efficient in. You take the number of jobs in a city, and if you make everybody, if you like, 1 or 2% better than they would otherwise be, the benefits are absolutely massive. Very hard to say, hang on Chris, you're 1% more efficient today than you were because you're doing this, but at the same time, intuitively, it is exactly what urbanisation and public transport is about allowing people to travel and optimise their lives as opposed to do everything within a very small area.
Which is why people come into cities in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah, so yes, the idea of making 7 million people 1% more productive.
Yeah, and if we took those numbers into the benefit cost calculation, goodness knows we'd be building railways absolutely everywhere, so we're not allowed to by our government, but that is one of the additional benefits of Crossrail.
Right, you say it's a £15 billion project. That's a lot of money for a city to find in this stage. So how's the Crossrail funding package coming together? How are you actually raising that 15 billion to build it?
Well, the good news is it's all raised and it's effectively in the bank. It was the biggest challenge of Crossrail was to assemble the funding package, and ultimately it hasn't been done with anything absolutely enormously novel or different that has never been done before. The trick has been to draw on a number of sources, and I think this is something that probably will become more common worldwide, to draw on a number of sources. So yes, there's government grant. Transport for London is also chipping in, and Transport for London is actually borrowing against some of the fares income effectively. But so there's government money, there's city money. There's also a supplementary rate on businesses. So there's a small contribution from businesses within London. Overstation development, so developing above the stations, not in the scale that you can get away with in Hong Kong and the like. It will never be that lucrative in London, but at the same time it is useful. And also developer contributions. So the big Canary Wharf estate, the developers around Woolwich Station, they will also be chipping in. So, and then the on-network sections actually comes from the funding. They're being done, if you like, through the UK National Rail funding mechanism, which is to put something onto something gruesomely called the regulated asset base, whereby effectively it's the government's credit card to build railways and then pay Network Rail back over 50 years. So it's actually bringing, none of those are new systems or systems that nobody had ever thought of before, but bringing them all together in a balance has been the challenge.
It's the sort of scale of adding it all, adding a little bit from here, a little bit from there, putting it all together into one big package. So that's the project, and the tunnelling I think is fairly well underway. The tunnel boring machine's boring at incredible rates.
Yes, if anybody sees, anybody wants to go on the Crossrail website, basically we now track where the 5 tunnel boring machines, there'll be 8 ultimately, there's 5 at the moment, digging under some of the most expensive parts of London at the moment, and the good news is that settlement's proving to be considerably less than the sort of conservative estimates that were made. So yeah, the tunnel boring machines are all up and very much going now.
That's right, under Hyde Park, so getting pretty close to Park Lane hotels.
Absolutely, they've now moved off beyond Hyde Park, so yeah, they're getting under Mayfair, and this is peak construction year for Crossrail. Again, one of the things that people will be familiar with, you know, is with these very, very big projects. In fact, all projects, they have a slow start, if you like. They then ramp up hugely in terms of spend, and then the reason that I joined Crossrail about 3 weeks ago as the operations director is because now the focus needs to move on to the operating railway. We'll be taking over some of the lines that will eventually go down into the tunnel in just about 2 years' time from now. So 2 years' time we'll be running trains up to the, almost up to the tunnel mouth effectively, and then in about 4 years we'll be running trains down through the tunnel, you know, in test mode, commissioning, and then ultimately in passenger service. So Crossrail has been at least 50 years since the idea was first put forward in London. You could probably trace it back a lot further than that. But
about 65.
Yeah, but we can now, you know, we're now within that distance in terms of geological time from actually running a train.
Actually, brilliant. So it's moving on to the operations. I mean, it sounds very simple, sort of tying together suburban networks east and west, but they're actually quite different in nature. So how are you specifying the operating in terms of the service patterns, journey times, and how do you tie all the operations together with those of the underground and the overground?
Golly, that's a brilliant question. Again, for people who aren't familiar with it, effectively Crossrail has two legs at either end of the tunnel, I think would be the very simple way of putting it. So you have 12, in the peak, you have 12 trains per hour from each of the eastern legs, the 2 branches, coming together into 24 trains an hour through the centre. And then out to the west of London, 10 of those continue beyond the central area, 4 of which go to Heathrow, 6 of which go out into the suburban area. Crossrail's slightly unbalanced at the moment in the sense it's much stronger in the east than you can justify in running in the west, and so therefore possibly running more to Heathrow in due course, extending Crossrail out further to Reading, or running an extra branch up something like the West Coast Main Line. All are things that are being looked at. Off-peak, the service goes down to around 16, 18 trains per hour, although one of the things I've started looking at in my very first week in Crossrail is whether we make sure we don't go too far down at weekends, because actually London certainly, and I think it's true of Western cities in general, is becoming more of a 6 and 7 day and even 24-hour activity. Crossrail isn't going to run through the night, it just doesn't justify it economically. But again, the the loadings in the evenings, travel in the early mornings, travel at weekends is all increasing. Ultimately, we're starting with 24 trains an hour. One of the reasons why we chose the signalling system, for instance, that we did, is because we want to be able to do 30 trains an hour if we need to. The forecasting at the moment says 24 big trains an hour through the centre is enough. We've gone back and looked at forecasting right across the world for big railway projects. The reassuring bit to us is that actually, for reasons that we shouldn't congratulate ourselves for, because it's just simply because there's a lot of good data in London, London has had a better record of accurately forecasting traffic on new railways than many other cities. And as I say, that's just because of the wealth of historical data and planning that's been around. But nevertheless, if you look forward, it wouldn't be any surprise if we need to go beyond 24 and up to 30 trains an hour.
And I think some of the underground lines are running 33 now.
Victoria Line has just moved to running 33 trains an hour, and if you like, that's becoming almost the benchmark for big parts of the underground and indeed even light railways in London.
So with that sort of frequency, it's all about dwell time, isn't it? It's not the technology of keeping the trains on the move. It's how quick can you get the passengers on and off at the stations.
Absolutely, and that leads us to the sort of rolling stock, and the fact we're out to purchase rolling stock at the moment. And one of the real drivers of that, or one of the key drivers of Crossrail and where you take it, is dwell times, as you say. We built an orbital railway in London, the Overground, in recent years, and one of the things we've learned from that, and it again isn't something that we didn't know in our heads, if not our hearts, before, is that fundamentally you can't design, geometrically, the laws of physics, if you like, do not allow you to fill trains with lots and lots of seats, as we all know, and at the same time have excellent dwell times in a central metro area. If you try that, you're likely to fail in some respect, and through no fault of their own, it was the British who built it, but kind of places like Sydney, if you like, suffer to this day with trains that go quite a long way out into the suburbs, double deck, long dwell times. Crossrail, we've tried to address that by limiting the geographical extent. You will only be going about half an hour out of London, and that allows you to have a train which is basically optimised around a sort of metro, low dwell time, high capacity, high standing environment. Yeah.
So the residents of places like Maidenhead who are used to fast trains into Paddington are going to find themselves in the same situation as the Metropolitan line passengers who've suddenly seen half their seats disappear.
They will. The good news is that Crossrail can be everybody's friend, because the increase in capacity is so great that actually a train that has a lower proportion of seats on Crossrail actually still has more seats than were there before. So actually, if you're living in Maidenhead, the good news is that yes, you'll still have as many seats as you had before, in fact more. It'll just be when other people get on further down the line, they'll be standing. Right. You'll be feeling very smug.
No, that's right. So so you're replacing a packed 3-car train full of seats by a 10-car train with lots of standing space.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you've talked about what Crossrail is doing, and you've mentioned the Overground. I mean, one of the key points about these 9 stations that you're putting in the central areas, they're all interchanges. They're all connecting up with the underground network. You've got passengers flowing on and off.
Yep.
Has there been a lot of thought into the sort of station design and how to manage the passenger flows within those stations?
There has. There's been an awful lot. One of the reasons why the project is so expensive is because a lot of the work is going into the heart of London. You can't find more difficult places to build railways than Moorgate, than Farringdon, than Tottenham Court Road, than Bond Street. But connecting those up and making sure that they have decent interchanges, you're still ultimately feeding people at an interchange into an underground system that itself, is 100 years old.
And bursting at the seams.
You have to be careful not to create what we might term a tide mark, where you have this sort of huge new passage that looks like something on the screen behind us, and then all of a sudden a sort of tiled wall that looks like it's been there for a century. So actually blending the stations together and making them work efficiently has been a major effort and cost. The other thing that's been very important in thinking through Crossrail is actually things like ticketing. The more experience I get of railways, the more it comes home to me that there's a danger, at least, that we focus almost exclusively on the physical elements, particularly of what we call integration. You know, we use this phrase integration, and what we often mean by integration, or appear to mean, is physically connecting things up, building, I don't know, bus stations, all of which are lovely around railway stations, necessary, but not sufficient. The biggest changes in integration that I've had in my sort of 27 odd years, 28 probably by now, of working in transport in London has been when we introduced the travel card, the paper ticket that could be used on National Rail and the Underground, and then in recent years when we introduced Oyster, the system that allows you to travel on effectively one ticket throughout any modes in London. And so harmonising ticketing and also harmonising information. The other thing that's now been replicated in many, many places throughout the world, and again the best ideas are often the simplest, is what's termed the rainbow board, the board that shows all the lines in London Underground to start with and shows whether they are good, you know, minor delays or worse. We added Docklands Light Railway to that, we added Overground to that. Now the national rail networks are beginning to add into that as well. You know, we're beginning, one of the things the Olympics taught us last year in London, you know, probably the strongest real learning out of the Olympics was the importance of so-called travel demand management. So everything from guiding people to use the most intelligent route to telling them in real time if, you know, that was still a sensible choice or whether that route was still very busy because lots of other people had chosen it, guiding people away from what were, fortunately through the Olympics, very small perturbations. So actually information and ticketing for Crossrail, as well as for all new railways in cities, I think is a really key feature, as well as the what we might term the hardware.
Yeah, particularly as a network gets more dense, and there are more opportunities of different routings through the middle.
Yes. Yes.
And you can sort of divert people off, and sort of,
yes, and
instead of changing at A, you change at B and C.
Yes, and I mean what we're ultimately trying to do and moving towards in London, particularly with, you know, coming back to ticketing, is so-called wave and pay. So actually, again, if you look at it, and some of you may have heard sort of statements like this before, you know, we are a very, very curious industry in that historically we have taken whatever our national currency is and then spent 10% of our costs, some of us, on converting a national currency into a special currency that we have, a sort of ticket that says this is valid on our network. Now with things like Oyster and Octopus and the like, you know, we've begun to reduce those costs, but actually in London now on buses this year and on rail in years to come, we're now moving to being able to put a bank card, you know, on a reader, and if you like, not go through that intermediate step of changing currencies. So that sort of, you know, that sort of soft integration, if we can call it that way, good for passengers, but also good in terms of simplifying and allowing stations and staff to actually focus on what they're good at. Because again, just taking ticketing as the example, the last place you want a member of staff, when we built the Overground, we took over a lot of old underground stations, the last place you want a member of staff is stuck behind a 1.5-inch thick bulletproof glass window that's about that big, where they were put in the 1970s when people were worried about people poking shotguns at them. Now actually, you know, in a cashless society and where actually crime in London has declined spectacularly, that's not appropriate anymore. People are quite happy to be out and about, members of staff, but you need to give them the physical ability and allow them to be out there, not caught behind glass, not stuck away in a corner.
I mean, it intrigues me, it amazes me every time I'm on the Underground that people are making station announcements while they're walking up and down the platform, because the technology now facilitates.
Because they're all mic'd up like we are, we can wander around.
Exactly.
This train is to Richmond.
Exactly, yeah. And it's getting there, it's meeting the customers face to face, it's dealing with people.
Yes.
Ticketing, the sale of tickets, whatever form, is a very simple transaction.
Yes. And the other sort of thing that we've been looking at with Crossrail is, in terms of customer satisfaction, we're absolutely hooked on the idea, the bedrock of customer satisfaction is obviously safety, but then beyond that, operational excellence. That's, without operational excellence, you fail. And at times in the past, I think in London, if we're being self-critical, we possibly, a few years ago, got rather good at apologising and offering information and sort of forgot the day job. There was a bit of a focus of, let's get good at explaining what's not working today, let's write excellent responses, let's have great websites. Actually, no, what the Olympics taught us and what we've tried to hold on to is you need operational excellence. You then need to be very good with information and the likes of ticketing. Now, in some of our networks, we're beginning to realise that we've almost reached the limit of what in a London context will take customer satisfaction higher in terms of just straight reliability and performance. The Docklands Light Railway, as an example, is so reliable these days that while we strive to take it more and more reliable up to what we might term Asian levels, actually passengers we lose almost no customer satisfaction because of reliability. But what people do want is they want what we've almost termed humanity, personal interaction, the softer stuff. So we're beginning to focus more on that, hopefully without losing the sort of bedrock of reliability.
Actually, one thing, we're talking about reliability, one thing that struck me about Crossrail is that there is virtually no fallback provision within the central area. There are no loop lines, there are no spurs, crossovers.
Absolutely.
What goes in one end of the tunnel's got to come out the other.
Absolutely. And that's partly by design and partly driven by just the cost, but also the complexity and the legalities of building big caverns within London. Actually, because the crossovers were particularly problematic in terms of settlement, noise, vibration and the like, actually that weighed against providing many, so we've got one. But yeah, consequently we're looking for tremendous reliability, in terms of rolling stock, in terms of signalling, in terms of operations. So technical reliability. The other thing though that leads us to is actually, again, bringing in this softer side in London these days, and again it's a learning from the games, not just technical reliability, but actually our biggest threat to running trains through pipes, if you like, on the underground these days is actually passenger health. The biggest reason for stopping trains at the beginning of last year that was beginning to cause us problems was people who were having, fits, asthma attacks, potential or actual heart attacks on trains. And you were leaving trains, as we all become slightly more sensitive and risk averse, trains were being stopped, for half an hour in a tunnel with trains piling up behind, to deal with medical emergencies. Now, we've now begun to address that. We've got a set of police who are trained in first aid and are able to go to site and be a bit more proactive, if you like, than the ambulance service traditionally was. We've started an education process with the hospitals saying, if you're a nurse or a doctor and you see somebody lying on a train floor, please don't dive in and say, don't move that person, because actually what you're doing is sticking thousands of people on trains behind in a very uncomfortable situation.
Which could
you need to join us in getting them off the train. So all of these, we're moving on. It's like peeling an onion. As you solve the first problem or solve the first challenge, you move further and further on. And the Olympics, if you like, was a good really good test for us in terms of forcing us to go further and further into the onion, if we can continue the analogy.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So that's the customer. So the reliability is a fundamental part of the specifications then for the rolling stock and the signalling and in terms of the actual operations, you've just called tenders for an operating concession. What's the thinking behind that procurement? What's the relationship like between Crossrail and the operating concession there? And you've just come from London Overground, which runs on a concession basis. And what have you been able to bring to that process of finding the right operating partner?
I think one thing just to explain is that when we we run all of the networks I used to run, which is the Docklands Light Railway, Overground, our tram system in London, and now Crossrail, we use a similar concession model, which effectively is a performance contract. So what we don't do is transfer revenue risk. Unlike the UK government, when they let a suburban railway, generally invites bids on the basis of revenue risk. So you're, to some extent, betting on the health of the job market. In theory, your ability to attract passengers. Our experience, in fact, our very, very strong belief in London, is that given that the Mayor TfL sets the fares, given that we control most of the complementary and competing services, transferring revenue risk doesn't really incentivise the operator in the right way. So the contracts that we let effectively pay on performance. So we take the revenue, and from that revenue we pay a lot of money if the trains run on time and less money if the trains don't run on time. And that has driven high performance, which over the long run I think also, you know, does lead to greater revenue. But the very short run, if your train is late today, are you going to decide you're going to cycle to work from somewhere like Shenfield, you know, 20 miles out of London tomorrow? No, you're not. You're going to grin and bear it, so therefore transferring revenue risk isn't sensible. So that's how we let essentially our contracts, and put very simply, that's what, you know, that's the whole basis of them, that it's run the trains, employ the staff, provide absolute excellence in customer service. So there's payments for excellence in customer service, payments for revenue protection, and again we've got revenue. Ticketless travel on Overground, when we took it over, was genuinely up around 15% of people not paying. We got it down, it's now genuinely 1.5%. So if you incentivise, and that was done by big payments, big pain and gain if the operator brought the ticketless travel down. So run the trains, collect the fares, make the passengers happy, and
you'll get paid.
You can be very rich running one of our contracts. If you don't do that, then don't expect to be paid a lot.
Right.
It's as simple as that.
As simple as that. And the concession, and the operator has to be in place before you start taking over these suburban services in a couple of years.
Yeah, the reason we're actually out for contract now is because we will appoint an operator next year, 2014, and then in May 2015 we will take over the rather run-down suburban services that we will be replacing in due course with trains that go into the central London tunnel. So there's a staged opening for Crossrail, if you like, that consists of taking over some services in 15 and then some others in 17, and then in 18 and 19 we will be phasing our introduction of services into the tunnel, so that by December 2019, sounds a long way away but isn't, we will have the full shooting match.
And so the new trains will come in on the existing lines as part of that process before the tunnel's actually ready? Absolutely.
Again, one of the early chief exec, or one of the predecessor to our existing chief executive at Crossrail, had a quite useful phrase, which again many of you will have heard, which was, he said he wanted to open the best 5-year-old railway. You know, and what he meant by that was he didn't see much benefit at being at the absolute cutting edge. You know, some quite big schemes in London and in the UK, notably the Jubilee line, West Coast Main Line, have suffered horribly by going for over-ambitious signalling systems. This is the Jubilee line 10 years ago, not the Jubilee line now, which works jolly well. But with Crossrail, the intention has been to take largely proven technology to stage things, as we did with the Overground, and we've learned to do with our underground upgrades, so that we have a smoother process of introduction. Not faultless, you never get something that big together without making a mistake, but at the same time it's a smoother process both for ourselves and also for passengers, and also in terms of, you know, the inevitable bedding in of the kit. Although we do need to, as an industry, still challenge ourselves that I can go to any car showroom in London, buy a car and pretty well just drive it straight out and expect to drive it to Glasgow and back, you know, for fine. And yet when we introduce new things on railways, we do still go through this inevitable bathtub, as we call it, of, you know, ironing out some of the bugs.
Learning curves.
And the more we can get away from that, you know, obviously the higher we'll manage to get customer satisfaction, particularly on new projects.
Yeah, no, that's all that's very clear for the new build, but you're on the existing lines. You're actually going outside the Greater London area. You're out on quite some way out onto the national network, outside the mayor's control. You're mixed in with they're very much mixed traffic railways. You've got 125 mile an hour express trains. You've got heavy freight traffic moving through, regional services. How are you going to achieve the Crossrail kind of reliability ethic when you're mixed in with all sorts of trains run by all sorts of other people on somebody else's railway?
That's the biggest challenge, and that's again one of the reasons why I've actually gone to Crossrail, because we need very urgently to develop the detailed timetable, the detailed modelling, and the work has been done, you know, as to the drivers of reliability on the outer sections. I think we know them reasonably well, but we now need to go this many years out into the absolute detail, because you're completely right that I have said one of the things I've been advocating before I actually got my present job, which puts me responsible for it, is that the thing that will potentially embarrass us on Crossrail on the first day probably won't be the thing we're all worrying about, like the signalling system or the rolling stock in the central area, because that's within our control largely, and we'll have tested it. The thing that could well challenge us more is a 45-year-old badly maintained diesel freight locomotive that chooses to sort of sit down on the slow lines at Acton. And that's exactly that's the challenge. The good news is that actually our Overground operation, which operates orbitally around London on some of the most crowded freight lines, has actually led us to identify those issues, if you like, clearly in advance. Mm-hmm. So yesterday I was sitting with MetroRail discussing exactly this, how we explain to the freight operators who have very low performance pain and gain regimes, how we work with them, you know, work with them frankly or work against them. I think they can choose which way we want to do it, but you know, work to make sure that they meet the standards of the trains around them. So you're absolutely right, you know, bringing a mixed traffic railway and particularly putting a high frequency metro core out into mixed traffic operation is a real challenge, and that is one of the that is one of the tricks that we'll have to master, and I'm confident we will for Crossrail.
Yeah, and taking the service frequency down the further out you go makes blending it in that much easier, I guess.
It does, and we'll have automated reversing at places like Paddington and at Plumstead. We will, because again it's something we've learned from Overground, we will have hot spare trains available. Every accountant in our organisation will tell you, don't, you know, it's a waste. Why do you want 20 million pounds worth of spare trains sitting around? The answer is no, you need them. You know, and nobody challenges that these days. We've learned that. We've gone beyond the ultimate financial optimisation and realised that ultimately, you know, we're here to provide a really top quality service, and if that requires a bit of spare resource at the edges as opposed to an accountant's dream, then that's what we have to do.
It's all about resilience.
It's about resilience. It's about having plan A, plan B, plan C, and again, we need to hold on to the learning, but that's something we had to have for the games, and we just need, you know, the lessons from the Olympics were not physical lessons largely, they're stuff that's in a lot of people's heads, and their attitudes. Ways of thinking. Well, actually, the same way we had to think if we had the opening ceremony, and what if this line goes and this line goes and this line goes. It's frankly the same mentality that you've got to bring to Crossrail.
That's right. My sort of concluding question I've got written down here is how does Crossrail deliver operational excellence? Well, you've picked up all these different aspects, but how do you bring it all together in terms of the ultimate customer experience?
I think by being very, very, very clear about what your objectives are, which safety, as we said, safety has to be a given, and safety is an odd one because passengers don't perceive safety in a necessarily rational way. You know, they won't mark something down the day before you're about to have, you know, an accident. They just don't perceive, you know, that it's not because they're fools, but they actually can't perceive, you know, the sort of problems. So you can't measure safety by customer satisfaction, but take that aside, if you like, and call that the absolute bedrock of what we do, then effectively you look to customer satisfaction. You know, increasingly our touchstone is customer satisfaction. Where that leads you back to is to the fact that that's got a huge correlation with reliability. So back to this idea that if you want a shortcut to customer satisfaction in a London context, you're better off just saying, what's my reliability stats? Measured sufficiently clearly and, you know, comprehensively. So reliability is enough. If you get the reliability right, you know, then you actually need to move on to the higher stuff that you will only pick up through customer satisfaction. And now we're moving on, and I mean, we should say we're not arrogant about this. This isn't saying we've got the answers. It isn't. It's just saying we peel more bits of the onion and find more questions. You know, when we go behind the hard customer satisfaction stats, that's when we're beginning to now identify these sort of emotional responses to I feel people care about me. So it's not just did you see some information on the train, you know, that the train was delayed. It's did you feel that anybody cared? It's this sort of emotional reaction that tends to carry, that people carry with them for longer, and that will lead to customer satisfaction scores even in 6 months' time. So it's safety, reliability as a component of customer satisfaction, and then just being really clear that, you know, customer satisfaction is what you're after. You can trail off down all sorts of subsidiary things that we as professionals think matter, but I think we do have to be humble enough to sort of come back to saying, well, actually, it's really, you know, the really key test, the acid test, is you know, what does the customer think?
That's right. I mean, there's going to be a session this afternoon on customer relations management, but effectively you've got to have a personal relationship with, what, 150,000 people a day or something?
Or more.
Or more.
And it's more complex than that because, of course, the other thing that will matter to Crossrail is that passengers, again, one of my phrases, passengers make journeys. You know, they don't travel on an individual mode. So one of the things I've been trying to educate my Crossrail colleagues in is that there is no gain, and don't worry, there's not a lot of people rushing off trying to do this, but we just need to remember that there is no ultimate triumph in building a beautiful Crossrail that almost thumbs its nose at, for instance, an underground station. Because actually people will make that journey in on Crossrail, they will transfer, and what they will remember and what they will mark us on is actually quite often the last part of their journey. So very aggressively saying this is our beautiful new bit, and by the way that's the rubbish bit that, you know, we need some money to do up, doesn't work in customer satisfaction terms.
It's transport integration. It's as much about the bus feeder, about the Crossrail, about the stations, the interchange. You say the ticketing, the information, the underground, overground. It's the door-to-door satisfaction, and of which Crossrail may be, if you like, the trunk carrier in the middle.
Absolutely.
But everything else adds into that journey experience.
Yeah. So we've got some people, particularly with a airline airport background, who are actually working with us on exactly this at the moment.